Welcome to a special edition of the Coffee House, where we'll meet the Democratic candidates who hope to unseat 8-term GOP Congresswoman Connie Morella. Morella narrowly won re-election 2 years ago. Her district has since been redrawn to the benefit of Democrats, who see this race as crucial to their hopes of recapturing control of the House of Representatives, which helps explain why more money is floating around this House race than any other. And leading the way, at least money-wise, is Mark Shriver, graduate of the College of Holy Cross, master's degree from Harvard, first elected to the Maryland House of Delegates in 1994, where he's built a reputation working on early childhood education and disabilities issues. Still, Mark Kennedy Shriver's frontrunner status perhaps owes more to who he is, the connections, the celebrity, the money, than what he's done. Also seeking to unseat Connie Morella is Chris Van Hollen, a member of the Maryland General Assembly since 1990 and the State Senate since 1994, where he's gained recognition as an effective champion for the environment, health care, education, and gun control. Before holding elective office, Chris Van Hollen served as a staff member on the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's a graduate of Swarthmore College, Harvard, and holds a law degree from Georgetown. Ira Shapiro has never held elective office, but he says his 12 years of varied service as a Senate staffer and tenure as a senior trade official in the Clinton administration make him the best prepared of the Democratic candidates to have an impact in the U.S. Congress. Ira Shapiro is a graduate of Brandeis, the University of California at Berkeley, and he holds a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Last, at least in the money chase and the polls, is Deborah Vollmer, a former staff attorney for the United Farm Workers Union. She's a vocal advocate for campaign finance reform and universal health care. Deborah Vollmer is a graduate of Clark University and earned her law degree at the University of Maryland. Not just a left-brainer, Deborah is also an artist. This is her fourth run for Congress. Welcome to this special edition of the Coffee House. You've briefly met the candidates, now you'll get to hear their views. We've left some time at the end for each candidate to make his or her pitch. We'll forego opening statements in the interest of time. We've only got an hour, and get right to the questions. Mark Shriver was invited to appear along with his rivals back on May 24th. The other candidates all responded yes within a day. 10 weeks later, this afternoon, the day of the taping, Shriver said no. Perhaps it's just politics as usual for a frontrunner to not date his rivals and to avoid tough questions in a forum like this, and politics as usual for a candidate awash in money to focus his exposure and message through buys in the paid media. Whatever. Mark Shriver's not here, but Chris Van Hollen, Ira Shapiro, and Deborah Vollmer are. Welcome to you all.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Ira, let's begin with you. The Constitution says that it's Congress that gets to declare war. One of the first decisions that you may have to make if you're elected to Congress is whether to endorse a war against Iraq. Under what conditions, if any, would you endorse that?
Mark, I think that the question of whether to go to war with Iraq is probably one of the hardest questions that any president and any Congress have ever faced. And I do think they have to face it together. I've been encouraged that the debate has focused more and more on the real issues. Saddam Hussein is a threat. He is amassing weapons of mass destruction. The question is, how can we bring about a regime change, and at what cost? Also, what would it do to the Middle East? What would we do if we won a war? What are the possible threats to our forces from the weapons of mass destruction we're worried about? There was concern early that the president was rushing to judgment on this, but I think actually what's happening is the president and Congress are working together. We're having hearings. There are consultations with allies going on. Intelligence reports are being studied. So I don't think there'll be any rush to judgment.
If the UN Security Council does not endorse a U.S. invasion of Iraq, and if U.S. territory is not threatened, is there a basis under international law to support an invasion of Iraq?
I think that we would have to build a case and a compelling case that there was a threat to the United States and to our allies. But in fact, I think that Saddam Hussein may well pose such a threat. And I think that what's going on now in the consultations with our allies, through the intelligence reports that none of us are privy to, is to assess just what kind of threat level there is. One thing we learned from September 11th, there are people out there that want to do unlimited harm to us. I'm not saying Saddam Hussein was directly behind September 11th, but he's used weapons of mass destruction before against his own people. He's threatened Israel, so we have to assess that.
Chris, a preemptive strike against Iraq based upon the possibility down the road that Saddam Hussein might use weapons of mass destruction?
Well, before I was elected in 1990 to the Maryland legislature, I served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And one of the things I did as a member of the committee was in 1988, at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, was travel to the Turkish-Iraq border. This is when questions were being raised about whether or not Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons. And I went out there with a colleague, Peter Galbraith, and we interviewed lots of the refugees, the thousands of refugees that were streaming across the border, and you could actually see the Iraqi troops on the mountaintops chasing after them. And it was very clear from those interviews that Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against his own people.
There is no doubt about that, but
Right.
there's also no evidence that Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons in the Gulf War, where there was a threat of retaliation, a serious threat of retaliation
Right.
by an external power like the United States.
Right. Well, he's used chemical weapons in Halabja, he used them in the Iran-Iraq War, he used them against his own people, and I think it's pretty clear that he has an intent of developing weapons of mass destruction, both chemical weapons, biological weapons, and if he could, nuclear weapons. So there's no doubt that if he continues to amass those kinds of weapons, and with the propensity he's shown to use them, he poses a threat. The question, as you raised it, is what do we do about it right now? And the policy for many years has been containment. I think we need to insist for right now on containment. We need to see if we can get the weapons inspectors back into Iraq on an unconditional basis. They can go anywhere, anytime. But I do think we need to start laying the argument for action, military action, if necessary, if those other things do not work. And I am heartened.
Even without support from the international community, without support from the Security Council?
There's no doubt that it's important to get support from the international community. I think that's why we're successful in the Persian Gulf War. I think in Afghanistan, our actions were made more successful because we had the support of Pakistan and Uzbekistan. So there's no doubt that having the support of the international community is important. Beyond that, I think if you can establish that Saddam Hussein poses certainly an imminent threat to anybody, then you have the basis for taking action. Where we are now is in that more gray area between whether he's an imminent threat or poses a real threat down the road and what actions we should take. And I am heartened by the fact that the Congress is beginning to debate this, because oftentimes Congress says, look, under the War Powers Act, we have the authority to make decisions, but then when it actually comes time to debate them, they run for cover. I would, as a member of Congress, I would look forward to participating in the debate. I think there's a lot more information that I'm not privy to now that I would need before I made the final decision that you're talking about.
Chris established a standard of imminent threat for an invasion of Iraq, an imminent threat posed by Saddam Hussein. Is that the standard you would use, Deborah?
I'm amazed at this whole discussion. After September 11th, Congress adopted a resolution which basically gave the president the authority to move militarily against any person, organization, or country that he determined was associated with the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and on the Pentagon. I said at the time, and I still say, that Congress gave away too much authority to the president. There was one representative, Barbara Lee, of California, who cast a lone vote against that resolution. I say to this day she was right. And I don't know how the president gave this State of the Union speech, and he talked about the axis of evil, and he lumped Iran and Iraq and North Korea together. It seems to me that there is this trend toward giving the president this authority. You know, the Democrats can criticize the president on domestic policy, but not on foreign policy. I think it's time that we started criticizing on foreign policy. Yes, there is a threat of weapons of mass destruction, but Saddam Hussein we don't have any concrete evidence, at least that I'm aware of, that he was involved in the specific terrorist attacks of September 11th.
In fact, there is no evidence to date linking
Right.
Saddam Hussein to Al-Qaeda.
You know,
However,
I remember Vietnam, and we, you know,
Deborah?
Yes.
We have to move on.
Okay.
Richard Butler, the former UN weapons inspector, testified recently before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And when he did, he made a very strong case that, in fact, Saddam Hussein is amassing weapons of mass destruction, and moreover, that he's a very bad guy, has terrible human rights policy, as you indicated, Chris, and said that, in fact, he should be brought before The Hague like Milosevic. And I thought, well, exactly right. That's exactly where he belongs, except that the United States, although the Clinton administration signed the treaty to create the International Criminal Court, the United States has not ratified that treaty. And in fact, President Bush made it clear he would never ratify such a treaty. Are we sending a mixed message to the world that we would rather go to war to solve these problems than handle it through the rule of law?
I think we are sending mixed messages in our foreign policy, and I think there is a lot that this administration is doing wrong in the area of foreign policy. You know, on the one hand, we're asking the rest of the world to support us in our fight against terrorism in Afghanistan, with respect to Iraq. And at the same time, we thumb our nose at many of the concerns the world has in all sorts of other areas. The whole area of global warming, where this administration walked away from the Kyoto Treaty and ripped it up. Formation of the International Criminal Court, where they took their signature off it and then said, oh, and we're not going to participate in peacekeeping operations in Bosnia until you make compensation for the United States in this area. And more recently, we're not going to participate and give our funding to international family planning efforts. I mean, it's one after another where this administration is clearly taking a very unilateralist approach to world affairs. And they are trying to have it both ways. They want to say, okay, friends and allies, help us out in the areas we care most about. But hey, you're on your own when it comes to things you care about. I think that's a big mistake and sends the wrong signal.
You agree?
I generally agree with what Chris said, although I wanted to say, Mark, Milosevic didn't just show up at The Hague. We had to fight a war to get Milosevic. And we had to do that despite the fact that our allies for quite a while were opposed to it. And ultimately, we managed to get the Europeans to go along.
You're talking about the war as opposed to the trial.
Yes, I'm talking about the war.
Yeah.
But I do think that we squander our moral authority if we go down the unilateral course too often.
What about the International Criminal Court? Should we be a party to that? Should we be trying to shape it?
Well, it would be my preference to try to shape it, frankly. And I think that the Bush administration has acted in too many areas unilaterally. I represent the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. I go to Geneva to try to negotiate a global tobacco control treaty because it turns out most of the nations of the world don't want their kids and women addicted by our cigarette companies. It would be a very important treaty for public health. The number one opponent to it is the Bush administration. That's not the face that the United States should be showing to the world, any more than it's the face we should be showing to the world when we walk out of the Kyoto Treaty without putting forth an alternative on climate change.
Deborah?
Yeah, this whole business of even talking about going to war against
International
Iraq.
Criminal Court. Should
The
we
international, I would support it. I think we should support the International Criminal Court.
Okay. The issue of global warming came up, and here we are. We're in the midst of a situation where we've been in an extended drought. We have water rationing in this region of the country, raging forest fires in the West. Whether we can attribute this to global warming, I can't say. But on the other hand, it's increasingly, the 90s were the hottest decade in a millennium. The first part of this year is the hottest on record. So perhaps that is what's going on. It's been proposed, an idea called the Green Deal for America. Here's the idea of writer Mark Hertzgaard. You tell me what you think about this. The federal government could jumpstart the demand for clean, efficient cars by buying its entire fleet in hydrogen-fueled cars. That would be 60,000 cars a year. And that would create sufficient support for demand for that kind of car that people would encourage Detroit to begin to produce that kind of car. Should the federal government be about the business of redirecting the marketplace to green the environment? Deborah?
Well, yes, I think so. And I drive a Prius, which is a hybrid vehicle. It's part gas, part electric. And I think government should have incentives. Not only should government vehicles be green, but also there should be incentives to encourage consumers to use the technology, such as tax incentives. When I bought my Prius, I didn't have to pay a tax on it.
I gather you might have had a role in that.
Well, yes. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the Bush administration on global warming, because one of the things they did, their own EPA had commissioned a report that came out and said, hey, look, global warming really is a problem and humans are contributing to it. And they said, you heard Bush's response, it was like, who are those guys? Right. His own administration.
Just the bureaucrats.
Just those bureaucrats.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't, if they don't want to see a problem, they just make sure they put their head in the sand. But I do think the government should lead by example. I do think the federal government should look for ways that it can purchase fleets in a way that leads by example. And I am happy that we did do this in Maryland, and that Deborah got a titling tax break. Well, 2 years ago I introduced legislation that we passed called the Clean Energy Incentive Act, which allows you, if you purchase a hybrid fuel vehicle in the state of Maryland, you don't pay a titling tax. And it's an encouragement, inducement to people, to consumers, to do the right thing and buy energy efficient vehicles. It also contained other provisions to encourage consumers to purchase energy efficient products. And it is something that I think we should be doing at the federal level. It's one of the reasons I'm in this race, is because there are lots of things we have done in the state of Maryland that I think we could extend to the federal government. We are only one state, so while we've led by example in Maryland in order to make a big impact on global warming, we really need to do these things as a nation, and it's something I look forward to working on if elected.
California is also leading by example in this area. They recently,
as they always do,
as they tend to do in this area, they've enacted a law that for the first time regulates CO2 emissions from cars. A good idea?
Well, I think that one of the reasons that I said I was running from the beginning was I knew that George Bush and Dick Cheney would be a disaster for the environment in the United States and globally. And they have been. Their drill, dig, and burn energy policy is a terrible thing for our environment, and they've taken us in the wrong direction. And I think that what California is doing reminds us that the Bush administration, when George Bush was running for president, he said, we're going to come in and regulate the 4 leading pollutants. And somehow when he got in, it turned into a 3-pollutant strategy, and he left out carbon dioxide. So I think we have to move at the federal level. I think what California is doing is a helpful piece of leadership, but it's not the same as our taking back the House from a group of people that are strongly anti-environment and laying the groundwork for the next election.
Let me just ask a question, because you're a lawyer, Chris is a lawyer, Deborah's a lawyer, we're all lawyers here actually. and there's a tendency to, lawyers have a very clever way of parsing words. So I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that at the federal level that we should be enacting legislation to regulate CO2 emissions from cars?
Well, I think at the federal level, we should be enacting legislation that puts limits on the overall pollutants, the 4 key pollutants, including CO2. I haven't looked at the question of whether I would regulate cars at the federal level, but cars are one of the leading contributors to CO2 emissions. So we have to do something there. The first thing I would have done, and I think the Senate failed us in this regard, was to start by raising the fuel economy standards, which in this country have been at the same level since 1985. I used to work with one of the auto companies, was a client of mine, and frankly, I know that they're capable of doing more, but they don't do it unless they're pushed.
And that takes us to our next.
Well, I haven't commented on
Oh,
this.
please
but
do. I'm sorry. Yes,
but I don't
please.
think this is an area where we have any disagreement. There are other
Hence.
issues where I think we will have disagreements,
Okay.
but this is one, I think we need to increase the fuel efficiency standards. We need to reduce pollution. I think the federal government definitely has a role in this. And it has,
in regulating
and it should. And including
carbon dioxide as
including
a
carbon
pollutant
dioxide,
from cars.
including it. Sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we should follow California's lead. It's too bad that the nation has to constantly wait on California to take the lead when the federal government should be taking the lead.
And it should be said that even if the federal government doesn't act in this area, once California does, that the marketplace may respond because
exactly
10%
right.
of the automobiles are.
Well, that's the advantage California has over Maryland, which is
sure
when we
does,
do that,
yeah.
we can't move the whole market.
But I think as Democrats, I feel that we didn't articulate this issue well enough in the last presidential election. It was a disappointment to me because Al Gore has been such a leader on the global environment. And I don't think the urgency that he has conveyed in his book and throughout his career, I don't think it came through. And I do think that in this election cycle, we need to do better in conveying that urgency.
I just want to mention, when I was in California, because people always talk about their records and their experience and what did you do, and okay,
What did you do in California?
One thing I did was practice law, and first with the United Farm Workers, and then with the Legal Aid Office, and then on my own. And when I was on my own, I did mostly court-appointed criminal defense, but I did have a case where, and I'm not going to claim all the credit for this, but I worked with a team of environmental lawyers, and we stopped a cement plant near Mojave from burning tires. They hadn't jumped through all the requirements of the California Act, so we stopped them from doing that. This plant was about to really pollute the atmosphere in that part of California very, very badly by burning tires.
Well, let's talk about tires rolling on our highways.
Yeah.
Because it seems that more and more are, and fewer people are using public transportation. The census data indicates that there was actually a rise in the number of people who are relying on private transportation, a reduction in the number of people relying on public transportation in the last 10 years. And this is at a time when we're looking to figure out how do we solve our transportation problems, because the Washington area is one of the most congested in the country. One proposal is to support various transportation enhancements, including the Intercounty Connector, which would, in the eyes of people who support it, solve the problem of congestion on the east-west route. Other people say that it would tend to be a magnet for development and therefore not have any impact, just cost a lot of money and cause environmental harm. What do you think?
Well,
What do you think, Ira?
Oh.
Well, I support the Intercounty Connector. I support building it in an environmentally sound way, and I think we can do it. But I also support it only as part of a comprehensive plan, which includes increased mass transit. More than 20 years ago, I played a key role in finishing the Metro Rail system when I was staff director for the DC subcommittee. We secured the last $1.7 billion for the Metro Rail and brought the Red Line into Montgomery County. So I'm proud of the Metro Rail, and frankly, here, mass transit ridership, as you know, is quite high, Mark. And indeed, the facilities are strained by the ridership that we have. So
Except that the evidence suggests that the increase in ridership is coming from tourists, not from commuters.
Well, I wasn't familiar with that, and I take that point. But frankly, when I get on the Metro Rail, and I ride it most days, it is quite crowded and straining. And we all know that the cars are straining to keep up. We need to enhance the operations of the existing system. we need to go ahead and move forward on a purple line. But frankly, on the ICC, I know the criticism that it's going to be a magnet for further development. But the truth is, it's been on the master plan for a long time. We've had the growth that we anticipated, but we haven't built the roads. And it still is the part of the solution.
So you don't think it will be a further magnet for development?
I don't think it will or has to be. And I think if you build it as a parkway, like the George Washington Parkway, if you're talking about limited access and limited exits so that you're not allowing people to develop across a lot of exits, I think you can control that. And I think we need to do it. Frankly, I think the Glendenning years, which were very good years in areas like education and environment, I think we did not move forward in the transportation area because the governor and many in the legislature were very strongly opposed to doing it. And I think it was
lost. And the county council.
I agree, but I think they were lost years.
Deborah, do you agree? Lost years?
I am the one candidate who has taken a position against the inter-county connector and also against the study. And I have hiked the area that would be destroyed. I have walked through forest and wetland that would be destroyed should the ICC be built. And it will be a magnet for development. And I just feel that it's a bad project, and that even the money for the study would better be spent on some other environmentally sound project. Now, I agree we have a traffic problem. I think many of us will not be willing to give up our cars altogether, but many of us could be persuaded to use our cars less frequently and take public transportation more often.
What if an ICC were strictly for HOV cars? Not even one lane, but only HOV cars.
There's still the problem of the area that it would go through, and the forest and the wetland that would be destroyed. But what I am for is increasing and expanding the metro system and improving it. I mean, we have trains breaking down in tunnels, we have escalators that don't work, we have elevators that don't work, and I think many people would take the metro. I mean, many people do take the metro, as those, I think the three of us candidates here who use the metro, many people do use the metro, but many more could. We've got to increase the capacity. Yes, we need a purple line. I'm not sure the inner line is the best route, and I will say this.
Because of the hiker-biker trail?
Well, that's one. Of course, the best route really depends on where you are and where you need to go. So, I mean, there are commuters who really would prefer an outer purple line because it better serves their needs. But I will say this, if we're going to do the inner purple line, you gotta put it underground. The Georgetown branch hiker-biker trail is really a linear park. It's in a part of the county that does not have enough green space. Once upon a time, when a train ran along that route, there was a lot more green space in the Bethesda Chevy Chase area. It's really a part of the Capitol Crescent Trail, the Georgetown branch. People
it's
use
the future part of the Capitol Crescent Trail.
And the thing is, there is no room. It's a narrow green space.
I biked it this past weekend.
Yeah, and there is no room to put a train at the surface. You can't do it unless you cut down all the trees. You just can't do it. So if you're going to put it at that location, it has to be underground. I would fight for federal funds to put it underground. But it must go underground, or it must go somewhere else.
What do you think, Chris?
Well, we are a region in gridlock. There's no doubt about that. I coach soccer. I have 3 children. I coach one, and the other 2 play soccer. I spend my Saturdays, teeth clenched, going from one soccer game to the other, and just trying to make it on time. And people throughout the county are experiencing that, not just on soccer Saturdays, but every day of the week. And I think there's no silver bullet. We need a balanced approach, and we need to move on all fronts. We need to move more on public transportation and metro. You talked about the fact that we need more people riding metro, but people can get to the metro parking lots. They get there at 7:30 and it's all filled. we need, if we want people taking Metro, we need to make it easier for them, both in ride-on and parking. We need to expand Metro up to Clarksburg and Frederick to get more cars off of 270. We need to move forward on road improvements. I voted this year in the Maryland General Assembly to resume the environmental impact study for the inter-county connector, which is part of the required process for moving forward on that project. I also think we need to move forward on a purple line. Now we've not just got two proposals, the county executive's got a third called the hybrid proposal. I support the inner purple line, but only if it can be done in a way that protects the Capitol Crescent Trail, because that is a natural resource, a beautiful, it's a beautiful resource for people in our county. I do want to say—
Put it underground?
That would be one option. I mean, that would be my preferred option. It is a very expensive option.
Or a single rail.
Or a single rail. So I think we need to look at those things. I do think that the most important thing for the person who's going to be the next congressional representative from this county is that we work with the county and the state to come to some consensus on the purple line, because no matter what route we have, it will improve the situation. And the worst thing you can have is one leader going before Congress and saying, I only want the money if it's the inner purple line, and someone else saying, I only want the money if it's the outer purple line. Because if you're a member of Congress from another state sitting on that committee, with all the other states coming before you with their ducks in a row, and these guys are fighting, you know, you're going to say, forget it. You guys don't get anything. And then the result would be no purple line and continued gridlock. So I think that the important thing is for the representative, the federal representative from this area, to work with the state and county leaders to get something done.
Mark, I need to say that when Chris's kids are older, like mine are, he'll look back on those days in the car with a great deal of affection. I miss those times when I used to drive them to soccer games. There's no one that's more devoted to the Metro system than I am because of my role in it. And I would say to Deborah, to others, you know, I wish you could do everything with mass transit. It's simply unrealistic. We have to have a balanced and comprehensive approach, but it does have to include new roads. And I certainly think it has to include the inter-county connector.
If you were to build the inter-county connector, given what you know about global warming, given what you know about 1/5 of the problem of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions coming from the automobile, would you put any stipulation on HOV lanes for the inter-county connector? Would you put any stipulation on even the kind of vehicles that would be allowed to have access to it? SUVs that are very inefficient gas guzzlers, would any limitations at all would you place on the access to it?
I think it's a real opportunity to think creatively along those lines. I mean, we've never really brought together the highway planners, the landscape architects, the environmentalists, the people, the talent that we have around here. We ought to be able to bring people together and build something that is the best parkway that solves the problem. And some of these creative ideas that you've put forth are very valuable. And we can mitigate we have to mitigate any environmental damage. Roads are built around the country. This isn't the only place that's ever considered building a road, and there are ways of mitigating the damage, and there are ways of ensuring limited access, as we discussed before. One of the problems that we've had is that besides the governor being against it, and many people in the legislature being against it for a number of years, we've gotten no leadership at the federal level. Connie Morella has never made this a priority because it's controversial. So she washes her hands of it. The next member of Congress, and I hope it would be me, ought to roll up their sleeves, bring people together, and use their experience to get this done. And next year is a very important year for transportation because the authorization for transportation projects only occurs every 5 years. I'm an admirer of what Chris did in Annapolis with respect to education this year. But I think at the federal level, the work I've done in the past over a long period of time working in the Senate would enable me to move in and actually have an impact on these questions.
We've been in the throes of perhaps the worst corporate scandals since maybe the Teapot Dome era. Maybe it was the Reagan era, I'm not sure. But certainly one of the worst in the history of the country. And we recently had some legislation, an agreement between the administration and Congress on means of attacking the problem, especially around accounting practices and certain CEO wrongdoing. Have we done enough, both not only to reassure investors in the marketplace, but to reassure pensioners and retirees that their life savings are not going to be wiped out, that they have a future in this country?
Well, you're right. This was corporate greed run amok. And you saw, for example, in the Enron case, the CEOs and the executives cashing out based on information that they were privy to that no one else was, and their employees who have been encouraged to invest in the 401ks plans that they set out lost their retirement savings, and we can't let that stand. I do think that the Sarbanes legislation was a very important step. I mean, what we saw was that the president gave this big speech one day about how we got to crack down on corporate, irresponsibility and wrongdoing, but really it was a lot of sound and no bite in his speech. There was some bite in the Sarbanes bill, which is why the president actually originally opposed the bill, as did the Republicans in the Senate and the House. What happened was they heard from all of us and all the people out there in America saying enough is enough. People who were losing their pensions, their retirement savings, and so they acted. I think we need to take a thorough look at what other options are available. I mean, that is part of what Senator Sarbanes did, but I clearly think...
What about limitations on CEOs trading stock during their tenure as CEO?
I do think there should be limitations on their ability to trade stock. Absolutely. I mean, this is... Certainly, they should not be allowed to trade stock at any time that their employees are not allowed to be trading stock, and making that requirement would mean that the information, whatever information they had available that they were basing their trade on, would be available to the whole market. I think it is outrageous that so many of these CEOs have been taking advantage of inside information, and not only when companies were doing better. When their own companies were going down the tubes, they say, okay, we'll leave everybody
Especially,
else.
it seems.
Yeah, we're going to leave everybody else holding the bag while our companies are going down the tubes. And, we talked about at one point, there have been some excessive arrangements of corporate bonuses for when companies are doing well. Well, this is just the opposite. I mean, here, they're being rewarded for driving a company into a ground. I mean, it's unacceptable. I do think we need to look at a whole bunch of different options. I do want to say that in Maryland this year, there was a proposal by WellPoint, which is a company out of California, to purchase Care First, which is a nonprofit insurance company. And as part of this transaction, they proposed to give the CEOs at Care First a $32 million bonus if it went through. Now, these are the guys that are supposed to be looking after the interests of all the ratepayers and insurance holders.
Well, they were going to sell it, take it private from being a charitable organization
exactly
to a private one. So they were doing exactly what the private sector encourages.
Exactly, giving these big bonuses. I'm very proud. I introduced a bill that would have stopped the deal in its tracks. We didn't get that through. We did get through a package of other legislation I co-sponsored that will make it much more difficult for this deal to go through, including it took away the bonuses, which were some of the incentives for the executives. And I think the kind of thing that we did with respect to Care First is exactly the kind of message we should be sending in Washington. And I would take that same message that I worked on this year to Washington to crack down on the corporate greed and irresponsibility.
Deborah, what's your message to crack down on corporate greed and irresponsibility?
I think this is another one of those issues where we're all in agreement. I mean,
are you in agreement on proposals how to deal with it? I know we're in agreement that this is a bad thing.
I supported the Sarbanes legislation, and I think you've got to for the accountants, you have to separate the role of being consulting and being a an auditor and being actually involved. I think there's a lot that needs to be done. Whether the Sarbanes legislation is enough, whether we're going to have to keep looking at this and enact more reforms, I don't know. I think sometimes I think legislators put something in place and they think it's enough, and then another year goes by and something else happens which shows that whatever the reform was not good enough. And I think this is one that we're going to have to watch for a while and see if we do need to go further than what's been.
Do we need to go further, Ira?
The system failed us at every level. I mean, we obviously had the greed of the CEOs. The so-called outside directors failed. The auditors failed. The SEC failed. You can go down the list. Everyone failed. And it was a period of real greed. I think the Sarbanes legislation was important, and I'm delighted that he rolled over essentially the President of the United States, who heard the message. But I do think that there are a couple of areas that we should have gone further in. First, I actually would have favored rotating the auditors every few years, telling corporations they couldn't use the same auditors and accountants. Yeah, 4 or 5 years. Mm-hmm. I hear it would have been an additional cost, but I think it would have been a well worthwhile cost. The second thing I would have done, and I guess it was the time that didn't allow them to do it, this whole question of treating stock options as if they're not expenses is an outrage, and I think that should have been dealt with. There are certain companies that are doing it individually, but it shouldn't have fallen to the companies.
For those of us who are challenged on financial matters, when you say treat stock options as expenses, what does that mean?
Well, right now, the period we went through, many of the high executives had huge amounts of their compensation in these stock options, but they didn't appear anywhere in the corporate books. And I think that's just wrong. They say it's very complicated to show how it's done. It's not that complicated. They just didn't want to show how it's done. But the other thing that we've talked about in some of our other discussions is the whole problem, and you may get to this later, Mark, but it's the whole problem of an economic policy of this administration that focuses on the interests of the wealthiest Americans and ignores the interests of others. That's why I've been so strongly opposed from the beginning to the Bush 10-year tax cuts, because they were going to mortgage our future and give these tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans and then turn around and say, there isn't any money for those things you want to do, whether it's health care, education. It's the reason we have to win this take back the House. It's the reason we have to replace the president.
One of the issues that tends to turn off Americans from voting and paying attention to this race or other races is how much money is involved in congressional campaigns these days. And the candidate who is leading the pack in this particular race didn't show up, but he's raised well over $2 million, which is a fairly astronomical figure for one congressional district in the country. Deborah, you've taken the opposite tack completely in this campaign. Yes. You haven't raised enough money to even register with the Federal Elections Commission. Tell us why you're taking that path, and is it really turning essentially necessity into virtue?
Well, for one thing, I think some people don't understand what this is all about. When you are running for Congress, once you have raised or spent $5,000, you must file with the Federal Election Commission. However, that does not get you on the ballot. There's another procedure to get on the ballot. You file in Annapolis. I was the first Democrat to do that, to file to get my name on the ballot. I have just been spending a little of my own money. My view of this is, I feel I'm a good organizer, but not a good fundraiser. I don't have those connections. I don't have that, that fundraising, that entree into the fundraising community. So I just decided, hey, I'm not going to play that game. This is not what elections should be about anyway. It's, I often talk about the Quakiutal Indians. And on my website, there's an article.
And I'm sure that a lot of times people say the what?
The what, yeah. And don't ask me to spell it, but it is on my website. Actually, I could spell it if you wanted me to. But in the 1930s, Ruth Benedict, a famous anthropologist, observed the Quakiutal Indians. And although I think we have a lot of a positive nature to learn from Native American culture in general, we would not want to emulate the Quackioodle. They would have these potlatches, and by the way, this may have been in reaction to their exposure to Western culture. This may not have been totally indigenous then, but whatever. They would have these ceremonies, and there'd be a lot of gift giving, you know, and that was kind of nice, but then there'd be these contests between rival chiefs. And the chiefs would pile up all their worldly goods. They would pile up blankets and canoes and jewelry and all their worldly possessions, and chiefs would get into these contests, and there'd be one pile here and one pile there, and then at the end of it, the chief who had amassed the most in his pile was deemed to be the most important, the most influential, the most deserving of leadership. And then, as if to say that that chief was more important than all his worldly possessions, the chief would set fire to his own pile. Now, to me, that's what congressional elections are like. And folks, I'm not playing that game. But people should understand what that means is, I'm not going to be sending out glossy mailers. We're not doing mass mailing. We're not doing paid television advertising. And so in a sense, and as a candidate, I can't provide that. What I can provide is a guarantee that I will be indebted to no special interests. I basically will be able to vote my own conscience, and I will be able to vote for those policies and issues that I believe in, and that's no secret because it's all on my website.
Okay. Ira, you haven't gone that route. You've been very successful in raising money. In fact, if it were in any other district in this country, people would say you've raised an incredible amount of money. However, here it puts you in third place among the Democrats, fourth place in the race overall. And so it isn't so incredible here. On the other hand, you're a lawyer, so you've raised a lot of money among lawyers. You've raised a lot of money you used to work with the U.S. U.S. Trade Representative's office. You met obviously a lot of corporate executives through that who've, I would imagine, have been helpful to your campaign.
Not as generous as one
you would have
hope.
liked. Yeah, no doubt.
They've been having a bad period.
As we've talked about. Do you see, we were talking before the show began about the nature of campaign fundraising and how central it is to a contest like this for Congress. Does it distort either your message or and ultimately, more importantly, the function of a deliberative body like Congress?
Well, there are a huge number of problems in the system, Mark, as you know. It's been a very instructive experience for me because this is my first time running. But even though I had a long experience on Capitol Hill, I hadn't raised money either. So I've actually had to learn it from scratch. It seems to me to be reasonable to expect a candidate to demonstrate some base of support. You know, it was my idea to run, and one way you do demonstrate support is to show that people will give you money so you can run a campaign. And a modern competitive campaign does require some money. So I've always regarded it as reasonable that I would have to raise some. I looked up the fact that you needed $925,000. That's the average winner's amount. So that's what I'm shooting for now.
Is that for the primary or the general?
That's for the primary. I'll let the Democrats take care of it if I can get through the primary. But I do think, I mean, our race is slightly distorted because Mark Shriver was always going to raise more money than anyone else in the country in a House race because of his powerful family connections. Deborah has opted out of the system. I think I've raised an impressive amount of money from a broad donor base of about 1,600 donors.
But most of them are not in the counties that you're going to represent.
Well, I think that most of them are in the region that I'm planning to represent. And I think that increasing numbers, as I've gotten better known, are from Montgomery County and Prince George's County. I do think that the system needs to be improved and fixed. We shouldn't be spending all our time raising money. I would favor and have always favored going beyond the McCain-Feingold legislation to try to get at the heart of the problem, which is television costs. I think that we should be getting free television.
Thank you.
And this kind of exposure is really wonderful. But I think that is the heart of the problem. The fact that the broadcasters are against it means that simply we just have to overcome their opposition, because the system...
It used to be that broadcasters were required to act in the public interest, at least under the Federal Communications Act.
And they're still supposed to sell ad rates at the lowest rate, but this has become, a real loophole and distorted as well. So I think on the one hand it's reasonable to have to show support, and I don't mind doing it, and I'm glad that I've raised this much money. On the other hand, the costs of these campaigns shouldn't continually skyrocket, and you have to go at that problem.
Yeah. Well, the airwaves should...
Deborah, you have raised the second most amount of money in this campaign. I gather you thought right from the beginning to run a successful campaign against someone like Mark Shriver, you'd need to raise a lot of money. And you've raised it from a diverse group of people across the county in a myriad of professions. Nonetheless, isn't there a problem about spending so much energy, so much time, so much focus on raising money, and doesn't that mean ultimately that you're going to pay more attention to the people who give the money than the people that can't afford to give the money? And if you look around the county, and you see this for all the candidates,
right,
that you can choose communities where there's almost no money coming out of. These are the poorest communities in the county. And then there are communities that are awash in money, and they're giving it all over the place.
Right. Let me say, I think our campaign finance system needs radical surgery. I think candidates spend much too much time raising money. I think the system stinks. One of the things that I want to do as a member of Congress is to help change that. I do think that in this county, the key is to raise enough money to get your message out. We don't have to, match the other guys dollar for dollar. I don't think the voters in Montgomery County and Prince George's County can be bought. I mean, there's a history of them supporting candidates who are not the best funded candidates, and I think that's good news in this election for the county. I am very proud of the fact that in our campaign we have by far the broadest donor base. We have more donors from in the community than any other candidate. Our average contribution is quite low by the standards of the others in the race, and I think it's a sign of our strong grassroots support throughout the community. These are people who care about issues that I've worked with for years in Annapolis, whether it's people who care about gun control issues and Million Mom March people, whether it's people who care about education issues and PTA leaders, whether it's environmentalists who care about the Chesapeake Bay protection, you name it. We have reached out to the people with whom I've worked on issues that I think are important to the people of the community, the regular mom and dad, not the big corporate interests in this community. And that has been the source of our support. And I do think there's a danger you talk about in our system where someone receives their funds from one source of money or lots of PAC contributions. I can tell you the PACs have not been rushing to contribute to my campaign. So
we've seen where they've gone.
While I do think it's a danger, and I especially think it's a danger when you have incumbents who have lots of money that they're being received simply because they're in a position of power. In this situation, as a candidate who's not an incumbent, I'm not holding a stick over anybody's head. I think these people are doing it
because they believe
the right reason.
All right, we need to bring this to an end because we're coming to the conclusion of the program, and I want to give everybody a chance to state their piece before we close. And we drew straws or pieces of paper in any event before the program began, and the order selected for the concluding statements was Deborah to go first, then Chris, and then Ira. So let's take it to Deborah.
Okay. Well, we were talking just now about money in campaigns, and I think there is a solution, which is we need public financing of campaigns. And if I get elected to Congress, that's going to be one of my priorities. Public financing of campaigns, and we also need rules requiring the TV and other media to provide candidates with free and low-cost time. The airwaves do belong to the public. Now, another issue that we haven't touched on, which I feel is very important, is health care. We have over 40 million people in this country who have no health care insurance. And we need to have universal, high-quality, comprehensive, publicly financed health care for all Americans. Now, there are many other issues that we haven't discussed. I do have a website at www.deborahvollmer.com. It's a long spelling of Deborah and 2 L's in Vollmer. I have position papers on a number of issues and my biography. I invite everybody to take a look because, again, you're not going to be seeing paid advertisement from me. We're doing a grassroots campaign. I'm going to metro stops, I'm going door to door, I'm going to flea markets and farmers markets, and I've been talking to people one-on-one, and that's the kind of campaign we're doing. And I just urge everybody to take a look at my website. Thank you.
Chris?
First, I want to thank you, Mark, for having us, and I want to thank the viewers who are watching the show. This is an important part of the process, and I'm very happy that you tuned in. I've had the privilege of representing a big part of Montgomery County in the Maryland legislature for the last 12 years. Before that, I served as a staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee doing national security issues, and I think that experience is particularly important in the aftermath of September 11th. As a state senator, I've worked very hard on issues that I think everybody in our community cares about. I've worked hard for smaller class sizes. I've worked hard on environmental issues to make those who pollute the Chesapeake Bay pay to clean up the waste. I've worked for more health care and greater quality health care for more Marylanders. And I worked to pass the first law in the country to require that guns sold have trigger locks. And when I say we've worked on these things, I'm not just talking about voting the right way or talking a good game. I'm talking about rolling up my sleeves and really getting things done by working with others in this community. You know, I was, Time Magazine did a story about this race a while ago, and I was very honored that they said that Chris Van Hollen was a hero to environmentalists, education groups, and gun control advocates, the voters Democrats will need to defeat Morella. And I do think that if we're going to take back this seat, we need a candidate who's really fought for the issues, who cares about the issues, and I ask for your support on September 11th. Is my effort to go back to the Congress and represent you in Congress to fight for a progressive agenda. Thanks.
Ira, September 10th, I think, is the primary.
What did I say?
September 11th,
Oh,
but I understand
you
why
are
that
right.
date might
That
be
is
in your
seared in
mind.
my memory.
Ira.
Mark, it's been a wonderful opportunity for us. This is the best discussion we've had in the campaign, and I'm glad the three of us took advantage of the chance to be here. I got into this race, which is my first run for elective office, almost 20 months ago. I didn't make the race because Connie Morella had become vulnerable. I ran because George Bush had become president. And I ran because I thought our country was facing urgent times, with the economy slowing, with peace breaking down in the Middle East, and with America's place in the world just not right. I didn't think we were doing enough on global poverty and global health long before September 11th. And now the times are even more urgent. I come to this race with the longest experience in the national arena of anyone in the race, and that includes Connie Morella. In 12 years working in the U.S. Senate, and then 4.5 in the Clinton administration as one of the chief international trade negotiators with the rank of ambassador, I have done the full range of issues from local and regional to national and global. The question here is, among good progressive Democrats, number one, who can hit the ground and have an impact on Capitol Hill for a progressive agenda from day one? And number two, who's the most electable against Connie Morella? I think my experience allows me to start right from the beginning and have an impact. That's why Walter Mondale came to Maryland recently to do a fundraiser for me, and he never gets involved in primaries, he said. And I think on the question of electability, Connie Morella is going to run on her experience. She's going to talk about her national and international experience, and we need someone with long experience in the national arena to match up against her. These are urgent times, and I ask you for your support, and I hope you'll join the grassroots campaign we've been running. Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a few committed people can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." So thank you for tuning in, and thank you for having us.
And thank you all for joining us in the coffee house tonight. The primary is September 10th. Hopefully, in this hour, helped you at home to be better able to cast your vote. And if you found a candidate to your liking, I hope you'll go out and support them. Again, Mark Shriver was invited to participate in this show and declined to do so. We'll be back after the primary in September with a regular magazine edition of The Coffee House.
So I was just thinking, just trim the ends just a little.
I got it from here, Monsieur Salon type guy. Hey, today everybody is pixie cut day. We're gonna take it real short and then we're gonna dye it. Jet black, the look that says, I scribble dark lyrics in my journal.
No pixie cut.
It just says, I've got issues.
I don't have issues.
Well, you will after this haircut. Pixie cut it is.
I don't want a pixie cut.
Yes, you do.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.